Today, we are talking all about how to scale your SEO. So you've done some of the fundamentals, you've got the groundwork in place. Now, how do you take your SEO and scale up your organic traffic, your leads, your sales, your performance from 1 to 100? So that requires some very different activities and very different things to do than what got you the foundation, right? So we've got the perfect person, of course, as always, to chat about this today. He is a brilliant, not only SEO strategist, but also marketing strategist. He actually drives strategy for some of our keyest of key clients here at WebMechanix. He is a longtime personal friend of mine and a super awesome silver-tongued fox. Alex Swope, Director of Strategy at WebMechanix. Welcome back to the Growth Fund.
Thank you so much, Jarrett. Yeah, Jarrett and I actually went to England together at one point in our lives together, and I wouldn't be here without him. He brought me into the fold, and I've been happy, for the last 7-8 years here. So yeah, let's talk about SEO. It's kind of where I cut my teeth here, and it's kind of one of my my original loves of digital marketing. So yeah, and everybody wants to scale, right? We usually talk about that in terms of scaling, our advertising, right? That's, you add more dollars to it. How do we do that efficiently? How do we choose the right channel mix of those kinds of things? But of course, our other channel, organic, is something that we can scale as well. And sometimes we can scale it much, much harder than we can our advertising for a variety of reasons. So SEO, great place to look at if you're looking for more volume and to have a bigger, chunk of awareness entering into your audience.
Love it. So before we start scaling or start thinking about scaling, let's cover the basics. Like, what are some of the foundations we should have in place before we're like taking it to the next level?
Yeah, and so you mentioned, we've got the foundations in place. So to me, that means that we've got our existing content, especially our kind of like services and offerings content, the stuff that we want people to land on and buy. We've got that optimized for those high intent kinds of keywords. So people looking for services, products to solve a problem, right? This is usually going to be whatever you're selling. So we want to have all of those pages, optimized to 100%. And what we usually do is go through a backbone process where we'll identify what are the most important pages of the website that have that kind of like buying intent, so that we start there and start immediately trying to rank for those things that are closest to your money before we start thinking about, okay, well, what are the other people in our environment or topic area that we can get in the door that might not be necessarily ready to buy yet, but we can start to have these conversations and introduce them to ourselves. That moment of going beyond the people who are, your ready to buyers and expanding into more middle of funnel and top of funnel kinds of content is what I really think about in terms of scaling your SEO.
Yeah, and there's almost certainly there's pages on your website right now that are great pages that could be optimized and should be optimized, but are just not optimized. So one of the ways that we think is basically 80-20. So what are the quickest and easiest things that we could do to generate some lift? And another piece that you want to think about is first improve, then innovate, right? So we could start a little bit more fancy, but if anytime we get a new SEO client, the first thing we do is this SEO backbone process that Alex is talking about. Keyword research, figure out what people are searching for, then look at the pages that you have, map those pages to individual search terms that you would like to rank for, optimize those pages at key SEO points, and then all of the leftover keywords and the leftover topics are basically the inputs into your editorial calendar. If you don't have a page to map a keyword to, then basically that could be a good page to create.
Yeah, totally. And so that's kind of like what we're assuming you've kind of already got in place before we start talking about, going for what you might consider cooler leads that are, more top of funnel. But in order to make those leads really valuable, in addition to having, kind of your SEO low-hanging fruit covered, we also need to make sure that the rest of your marketing ecosystem can handle this influx of new leads, because you're going to need conversion mechanisms to capture these people that might be very different from what people coming to a service page are converting on. So services pages, that's usually, hey, contact us for pricing, get a demo, get a discovery call consultation, those kinds of things, especially if you're on the B2B side. And then the people coming in for more top of funnel things, they're going to be looking for education, most likely. So we're thinking white papers, ebooks, infographics, things like that, where we're not asking them to really get very deep with us right off the bat. We're asking them to basically shake our hands and introduce themselves so that we can nurture them through email and outreach from your sales team to the best prospects, and getting them kind of into your pipeline that way. So a nurture program is kind of a necessary step as well. And then the other thing I would say is having a good understanding of the user journey, especially at that moment where they're becoming aware of the problem, because that's probably where the highest volume of search queries are going to be, is on that kind of content. And I'll talk a little bit about how to find that content in the most efficient way that I've found.
Yeah, but you bring up a good point. Sorry, Jared, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to summarize, Alex. It sounds like the key is, like, if you're going to scale your traffic, especially your organic traffic, make sure you know what you're going to do with it, right? Figure out a plan. If we're going to bring this traffic in, how are we going to make sure that we are able to either convert it on the front end or keep them engaged with us in some way so that eventually they get into our funnel?
Yep. Yeah, so conversion is always an important factor. So conversion, you guys know the hierarchy of needs, where there's like, the basic food and water kind of thing, and then it goes up the pyramid, and at the very tip, it's enlightenment. So that same thing applies to SEO. Conversion, I would say, is higher up in the hierarchy of needs, like above food and shelter. But its very close cousin is UX and user experience. So like before you endeavor to scale any SEO program, it would make sense to pick off the low-hanging fruit that you've already got, to at least start thinking through the conversion mechanisms, but also to really double click into the UX, the user experience of the site, because ultimately Google, ever since the beginning of time, has said, we are trying to create the best experiences for people. And like around maybe 2013, 2014, 2015, they introduced RankBrain, which was really designed around user experience. Then they released Core Web Vitals, which was also designed around user experience. So content abounds about these topics. It's things like page load speed, but also just like, is it cluttered looking and messy, or is it clean? Is it well organized? Is it confusing or more usable? I can grab a link real quick, but you definitely want to look at the UX of your site and do what you can do there as another part of that backbone process. So we sometimes think about that as the technical or the UX component, and it's cousins with conversion.
And that's a great point that I didn't mention is, in addition to the low-hanging fruit in terms of like optimizing your existing content, going through that SEO technical audit and making sure that there's no red flags that are going to prevent you from scaling because you've got a bunch of broken links or, a bunch of content that's not indexed or whatever the case may be.
Yep, 100%. So
thank you, Elizabeth. I'm glad you like that. And
yeah,
I just dropped a pretty good link on just SEO and UX, which if you're interested in more on that, but it definitely makes sense to do that. I'm big on analogies, as Elizabeth has mentioned, but it's like, it doesn't make sense to like if you have a car where the engine is old, is kind of a clunker, like it doesn't make sense to really invest a lot into the body unless you're really planning on changing that engine out at some point too.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So we've got our foundation. Sorry, good, Alex.
Oh, I was just going to say, because I think this is what you're kind of leading into. So not only what do you have kind of like in your marketing ecosystem, but like, how does your approach and your mindset even maybe change here?
Right.
And I think, again, starting out, it's a lot like checking the boxes, making sure that the best practices are involved. But once you've got that, then it's actually kind of becomes a lot more fun, because you're not just checking boxes, you're making very strategic decisions about what kinds of content you want to produce and what kinds of people you want coming in the door. And so one way that sometimes is a paradigm shift for people is thinking about your organic traffic almost as if you're audience building rather than necessarily like generating leads, because you're going to get maybe 98% of people hitting your site that probably aren't going to convert. So, but there's going to be a tremendous volume of these people, most likely. And so thinking of that as an audience that you now have access to, that you could remarket to, even if they haven't converted, right? You can do some really robust stuff with those people. But remarketing is another really big thing to think about when you're talking about scaling SEO, because that's going to give you many, many, many more touch points in front of these people than, potentially the only one time that they hit your website.
Yep. And I would add, like, it's good to think about sort of the market maturity and what kind of stage of the buyer's journey you're marketing to with your content, right? So like, if you're bringing in a lot of top of funnel traffic, maybe they're not ready to buy yet, but you're creating that awareness, and you're one of the advantages of that as you scale SEO is you're reaching the buyers earlier in their journey versus if they were to just hit your service page, right? So you're able to create that awareness earlier, set those buying criteria with your organic content, then over time nurture them to become a customer. So as you scale SEO, you can also scale your strategy for how you create preference for your brand in the market, which I think is a very powerful aspect of scaling your SEO and organic search.
It's all merging together. And very quick and fun story. When we started out, SEO was our first ever offering, our first ever service line. And we were really good at it. And we drove a whole bunch of traffic. And guess what our second offering or service was conversion. Because it's like, there's no point in SEO unless you're converting. So you might think like, hey, well, why are we talking about remarketing? I thought the topic was SEO. But we don't do SEO for the sake of SEO. We do SEO to get leads and phone calls and downloads and trials and conversions. So it's all blending together. It really is.
And I think, Jared.
And then there's the robots. The robots are coming. No, I'm just
oh, we'll talk. Oh, don't worry. We'll talk about the robots.
Yeah.
But the point, Jared, that you made about controlling that narrative earlier in the user journey, yes, we want to drive leads and all of that stuff, but that's kind of one of the intangibles about scaling your SEO program is that awareness that you're generating for your brand and, some of the kinds of content that you're producing, especially if we're talking about like a particular service or product in your industry that you're competing with a lot of people for, putting out a guide of like how to select whatever that product is, getting people in there, you're essentially controlling the narrative of how people are going to think about buying this service or product. So they're not always going to be like that direct, but that's just an example of, again, controlling that narrative with that top of funnel SEO content can be a really powerful thing. That's kind of an externality that you might not be able to measure with, here's how many organic leads came in.
Yep. That's exactly it.
So, yeah. And so in addition to kind of understanding what, through personas, through keyword research, figuring out what kinds of questions your users are asking. Once you kind of have an understanding of that, you're going to need to eventually solve for content production, right? That's the bottleneck that a lot of people are going to encounter as they're starting to scale. their SEO programs, right? Because generally speaking, if you want to capture a new bucket of keywords and rank for them, you need content in order to rank for that. And if you don't already have the content that can be optimized in order to do that, you're going to be creating new content from scratch, which is a heavy lift. So solving for that and doing that efficiently is kind of the next kind of big challenge that I think a lot of people face when talking about scaling their SEO. And I think it's because they just don't have the resources in-house generally to do a lot of content production. It's time intensive, and it requires people that are both, knowledgeable about the industry, service, and product, and like to write, which oftentimes is very, very hard to find. That's kind of a unicorn in a lot of cases. So oftentimes, the marketing manager gets saddled with that because they're usually good communicators and they usually are very knowledgeable about the products and services. So one way to make that easier on yourself, the obvious way is freelancing content. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend that until you go to start scaling and really building out robust content plans, because that bottom and kind of middle funnel optimization that you've been doing up until this point is probably going to require some pretty deep kind of product and service knowledge that a freelancer is not going to have. However, when we start scaling up to more top of funnel content, that's usually going to be more kind of educationally focused and more general, something that's much easier for a freelancer to write because it doesn't require quite as much deep internal knowledge. But the other thing that I would always encourage, if you do choose to, leverage yourself and your knowledge through freelancers, is providing really good outlines and the, important kind of technical internal information that they need to know and include, so that you're really focused on, again, the 20% of the content that you need to actually contribute to, and the freelancer contributes the other 80%. So that's one way to kind of scale up and leverage yourself. But there's also some really good advances happening in AI around SEO and around content writing and copywriting that have been maturing at a pace at which I would start to recommend leveraging that, especially if there's not necessarily the budget for, a lot of freelancers, or if the content is, for whatever reason, that just isn't an option. So one of the kind of main, before I jump into that, the other thing I just want to mention is one other thing to consider is that, we mentioned the technical SEO, talking about on page, but then of course there's off-page SEO, backlink building, and things like that, which are, can kind of consider like SEO PR in a way. Those are sometimes very different skill sets that you may have to look to hire for separately. Usually the person that's really good at content marketing and on-page SEO is not necessarily going to be the same person that's got the killer SEO, technical SEO chops, who might be, kind of sitting more towards like the developer side of things. And then, like I say, like the backlink outreach is someone that maybe has more of a PR background to be really successful at that kind of stuff. So not necessarily that you have to make these kinds of hires if you're scaling, but just be aware that if one of those three areas is more important than others, one person might not be able to service all three of those things at a very high level.
Yeah,
so
a couple
feels. Go ahead, Jared.
No, I was just going to say, I was just going to add to a couple things, Alex, to your point about where can you find leverage to, scaling up your content specifically. One thing that, we've helped our clients with and we've found very effective, as an agency, is to take a lot of the content you're already creating, or for example, let's say you're doing a webinar, or let's say you're doing an event like this, like we're doing right now. Take that, take the video, pull it down, get it transcribed, or you can use a tool like Dscript. Dscript.com, I'll pop it in the chat. It'll automatically transcribe it for you. And then take that transcript and turn that into your content fodder, right? So if you're already doing events that are going to be recorded, use that recording and turn it into one blog post or multiple blog posts, right? Take that, content, that media you're already putting out there and use it to your advantage, right? Maybe you're doing a podcast. Are there snippets from that podcast you can turn into a blog post to, target a certain topic or a certain keyword, right? Use that grist to fuel your SEO strategy versus having to create everything from scratch. Sorry, Chris, you.
Here's an example. So we did that page. That page is 100% done by a third-party editor or writer that we use based on basically like an hour-long video.
Yep. And there's a tool you can use that I highly recommend. It's called Dscript, and it's built for this purpose, right? So the thing that's cool about it is it'll automatically pull down the transcript. It's not perfect, but it creates that sort of language that you can then use in a blog post. You can also use it to create social clips. It's a fantastic tool for this exact purpose.
So we're going to keep wrapping. As you guys know, we could go pretty much ad nauseum about this stuff, but we'd like to hear from you also. That's the whole idea of doing this live. So drop in the comments, what are you struggling with? What are your questions that you have? Are there roadblocks, bottlenecks, opportunities, whatever it is, tell us your story, and we'll keep wrapping for now.
And I think also I want to take it into like some concrete examples that I think would be helpful for people, because we've been talking pretty like abstractly a little bit. So let me show you this as an example of how I would start thinking about scaling our program and really driving that with competitive research, because that's a way that you're going to be able to efficiently figure out what's the content that we need to write in order to get a lot more organic traffic as quickly as possible. So rather than reinventing the wheel, you're looking at what are competitors doing that is working really well for them. I'm hoping this is actually going to let me share my screen here.
Now, one thing I want to preface, and you guys may know this already, but a common question in the SEO world is, what color is your hat? Because there's white hat SEO, which we are largely toward the white hat, which is natural. It's kind of, it's not faked. It's not really like AI scaled to the moon with a million junk pages. And then all the way on the other side is black hat, which is like creating thousands of pages a day using AI and building links in an automated fashion, right? So we are more toward the white, but I wouldn't say it's dove white. Like we're a little, so I think that there's like a nice little area that's like kind of light gray, where you can take some of those scaling techniques that are heavily used on the black hat side of the house, and use them to amplify your own efforts in a very light gray hat way. But I don't see much going on in the chat. Here's maybe the question that I asked was not good, but what color is your hat? Are you and your organization's a white hat, more of a black hat, or you gray hat? Where are you in terms of your bright white, Jim? Nice.
Jim's lawful good.
Yeah.
Faded white. I like it. All right, cool. Like a khaki sort of.
Jim is very afraid of the Google slab. Understandable. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would always say, learn from the dark side is what I would say, right? Like, don't necessarily emulate it. Don't necessarily follow the tactics, but there's a lot that you can learn about kind of opening up your thinking and how you approach things, and how you can maybe approach things in a more scalable way, or maybe like some obstacles in your head that you thought you had, you don't necessarily have. Like studying the grayer, blacker hats can be really helpful for that. So I would say don't necessarily emulate their tactics. I would recommend against that, but take a look, see what they're doing.
Now, an example of that I think is really good is, looking at something like building links and building them at scale. So doing that with, a bunch of crummy backlinks is damaging to you, but using that same kind of idea to think about how can we build internal links across our content in an effective way, Oftentimes that can be as simple as updating footer links, updating navigation links, updating like the page templates that you're producing content with to include, to kind of automatically include those links back to important pages on your site to help support their rankings. And so that's stuff that you can do that's very white hat, but can be done kind of at scale using your own websites, not building 1,000 one-page websites that all link back to your site, right? So it's kind of like using a black hat methodology or idea in a white hat way can be effective. And along with that, so right, you don't want to build a bunch of backlinks from sites that are not relevant to your industry, that are bad sites or anything like that. But WebMechanix, we've had some success handing out awards to sites that we think are doing a great job, and they get a little badge, and that has a backlink back to WebMechanix on it, saying that their site has been is kind of A+ quality as judged by one of the top digital marketing firms. So they like that. It makes them look good, and it also gives us a relevant backlink. So there's things like that. If you are in an industry that you are in a place to do something like that, that can be a great way to quickly build a lot of very quick backlinks. Or if you have a tool that people are embedding on their website, there's a lot of different ways to do that. But again, I think you make a good point. You don't have to be, you can still be very white hat and kind of borrow from some of those methodologies.
Yeah, and I would say the award strategy is great, not just because you have that sort of link bait, right? But you can basically make an award for the customers that you want, right? Say you're like I don't know, accounting software, and you want to celebrate the top CFOs, right? Or the top financial organizations in the target industry that you want, right? That's your list of people who you're going to get a link from, right? So not only are you like building a link from the websites of your current and or target customers, but you're also building those relationships at the same time, right? You're celebrating them, you're making them feel good, so that when your sales team reaches out, it's a very different conversation, right? You've built that awareness, you've built that relationship, and maybe a bit of like and trust too.
Yeah, the best way that I've seen to scale SEO is, at least in a white or like light gray hat way, is by creating, it's with a cultural shift. And some orgs already have this culture of publishing. Like orgs that have a culture of publishing, which include like a lot of legal firms, a lot of management consulting firms, like they're already publishing reports and things. It's just part of their industry. They have a huge advantage because they're content machines. And then so if you can couple that source of content or those sources of content, which every organization has hidden sources of content. Anytime that you're talking or writing, or any of your colleagues are talking or writing, basically they're creating some form of content. So if you can find a way to leverage that organizationally, that's one big thing. But then the second big thing would be to provide some basic SEO training to everybody on the marketing team, especially like anybody that's involved with the site maintenance or the blog. You'd be amazed, like a good webmaster with just a small amount of SEO training, a good writer or a good editor, a good social media coordinator or something with just a small amount of editing can learn how to take the raw content, which is the thought leadership and the intellectual property really that's already being created internally, and then leverage that using 80-20 thinking. Again, I'm big on that in general, but today I've mentioned it like 4 times, because you could spend the whole rest of your life studying SEO to become the best SEO in the world. But in a much shorter period of time, you could get the basic on-page optimization training to feel competent and capable to take like a raw piece of content, edit it, modify it with some keyword research, even to do some of that keyword research yourself on the fly. You could learn that probably within a couple weeks and half a dozen repetitions. And then by up leveling your whoever's managing and posting the content, like by up leveling that person, all of a sudden you're going to start getting way more traffic to the content that you're already publishing.
Yep, 100%.
I also like this idea of having like a broad kind of like at least basic knowledge of SEO, because even when we're doing advertising or coming up with webinar topics or coming up with, what's the next white paper ebook that we're going to produce in order to capture this, this attention that we're generating. Those topics can and probably should be informed by SEO, so that you know that you're producing content that people are looking for, whether or not you're expecting it to rank for SEO. That allows it to, kind of be more relevant automatically, because it's informed by these are the things that our audience wants to know about. And then it makes it much easier to repurpose that content because it was already kind of built with SEO in mind, at least in certain ways. So this is something that, we started doing with clients who, traditionally would have, their batch of ebooks that they're kind of creating internally. But since we're producing a lot of content that's driving people directly to their site, feeding into that, asset creation, that conversion mechanism creation with the SEO research that we've done makes those pieces of content much more relevant to the content that we're writing, and is going to be more aligned to the people that are actually hitting the site, as opposed to a lot of times that content is created kind of with, inside sales or sales enablement mostly in mind. So that's all just to say that feeding that SEO knowledge to the rest of your team can kind of help lift all boats.
Yep.
So Jim, you had a question about Responsa, which is a backlink outreach tool. I'm not super familiar with it, but it looks like it does a good job of automating some of the outreach and helping you organize that stuff, which is very helpful. There's free tools like hunter.io. That's like a Chrome plugin extension that helps you source the contact information for websites and stuff like that if you're doing backlink outreach.
Yep.
So again, I'm not super familiar with this tool in particular, but that can be like a really helpful part of the process, because at the end of the day, it is a little bit of a numbers game. But I would still highly encourage you, if you're using one of these automated tools, it's like blasting out a lot of messages. You still want to try to tailor those messages as best you can, so that, and Responsa even says that, on here, they're like, hey, don't spam, build relationships. And that ultimately is what you want to do. You want to build that relationship with a publisher so that not only are they giving you a backlink now, but maybe in the future, they're producing more content, or you're partnering in some other way. Yep. Yeah, sure thing, Jim. And there's also, folks out there that, you pay, $1,000 a month to go build kind of like white hat links. I haven't seen a lot of success with that kind of stuff, because, even if somebody says they're building you, a high domain authority link, a lot of times like these sites are not super relevant. It's just hard for an outsider to do. It's usually something that is, more efficiently handled in-house a lot of times. But it does require kind of a specific skill set that's different than your average, kind of like content marketer SEO, I would say.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jared, I sent you this doc. I'm having trouble sharing because I updated since the last time I've been on Zoom. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing that, I can walk through this, which is one of my favorite ways to start looking at scaling our SEO. So again, this is driven a lot through competitor research, which I find to be a really efficient way of finding what are the pockets of high volume content that's very relevant to our own business. So what we're looking at here is essentially a heat map of competitor rankings across a bunch of different organic keywords. And these are sorted from, highest search volume to lowest search volume. And you can see that we've got 4 different websites here, some of which are ranking for the same keywords, but you see there's a Venn diagram here where we've got that second column, we see some numbers in the green and yellow, but really it's that 4th column that we're seeing a lot of first page rankings on. And so these numbers from 1 to 100 is the current ranking that site has for that keyword. And so we can really quickly look at this and see, oh, wow, if we wanted to write a piece of content that was going after this search term with 8,100 searches a month on it, which is a very high volume of searchers, then we have identified a website that's ranking very well for this term. And we can look at the exact piece of content that site has written in order to rank well for it, right? So we can go through and look at the keywords and say, great, I love this keyword, I love that keyword, I love this keyword. These are all kind of cybersecurity related. And so they're relevant to the product that you'd be selling, which is a cybersecurity product. But we're reaching out across like this vast topic area of cybersecurity and focusing in on who are the competitors that are similar to us, what are the high volume keywords that they're ranking for, and what's the content they've written that's allowed them to rank for that. So we can go in and analyze that content to build our own in a way that we know is going to be competitive. If you don't do this step, and instead you're just driving it from keyword research that maybe you did in initial stages, trying to build out like your foundation, your SEO backbone, then you might take the tack of trying to build this stuff from scratch and really reinventing the wheel. So I would highly encourage you to take a look at something like this. This was put together through a tool called SEMrush that we love to use. It's a great view for quickly identifying what are those kind of high volume keywords that we should go after. So once we've identified those, we can look and see, in fact, great, this Gmail SMTP relay service exploit page from Avanon, which was the one that was ranking for that very high volume keyword up at the top. Well, in fact, that page not only ranks for that keyword, but it ranks for 32 other keywords. And the total search volume for those is like 12,000 searches a month. So looking at it this way, we're actually seeing not only is that a really great high volume keyword that this page ranks for, but in fact, this page is doing a lot of other heavy lifting. So, once we've got what are all of the different keywords our competitors are ranking for, we can do some Excel work and, work some pivot tables to say, great, what is their most important content? What are the keywords that it's ranking for? And how can we write content that is competitive with that? And so I've got a couple more slides of just, going through that. And then I've got going into another tool that I really like that, again, helps take this competitive research and turn it into really efficient, actionable steps. So this is a tool called Surfer SEO, and it does a really good job of this competitive analysis in terms of the content itself. So it'll compare all the first page ranking content around a particular topic or keyword. In this case, we're looking at clone phishing, which is another kind of cybersecurity topic area with a high volume of search around it. And comparing a competitor's piece of content that is ranking well for this, for clone phishing, but putting it through a tool like SEO Surfer analyzes that piece of content and makes recommendations on how to make it even better. This is literally taking a piece of content that's working well for a competitor, putting it through a tool that's going to tell us how to make it even better. And then it's just a matter of kind of following the instructions. And so here we're looking at a list of terms that is not even kind of standard keyword research. It's using AI to look at all the other first page ranking content for this topic and pulling out all of the kind of what it calls natural language processing keywords. That's why you see kind of NLP listed across a lot of these. And so these are keywords that might not turn up in kind of traditional keyword research, but this AI tool has analyzed the top ranking content and said, look, the top ranking content is talking about, is mentioning these keywords and it's mentioning them kind of in these rates. So, this piece of content mentions this keyword 13 times. The top pieces of content are talking about it way more often. And so it gives you very specific actions to improve that content. In addition,
yeah, that's
to
one of my
this
favorite
kind of
things to do is
go ahead.
basically like search for whatever term you really want to rank for. Look at the top pages that are already ranking and say, hey, how can we make something better than this? And because a lot of times you'll find that well, not a lot, but sometimes you'll find that the pages that are ranking are actually not all that good. Like if you read the content, like they're not that useful and they're ranking on account of things like keyword density. But I think like an ultimate hack or like the idea of like, how can we create content that's better than the stuff that's ranking is a good cultural hack, because if you can get that kind of thinking to permeate the organization, then you can really make some progress. And the other ultimate hack would be to get your CEO or your CMO like not only bought into SEO, but like excited about it. And you can do that. We were talking about how everything is merging. Your CMO or CEO might not really get too excited when you say SEO because they conjure up some images or whatever they think that SEO is. But the reality is that SEO is pretty well intertwined with thought leadership. So if you use the language thought leadership and like, we want to get our thought leadership out into the market, that could get them well excited. Another quick note on cross-training and upskilling folks is that a good PR person, we were talking about outreach, but a good PR person, like basically outreach is what they do. A little bit of training on link building in terms of like, basically, hey, when you book that podcast or when you book that thing, like get that link back and get it back in this certain way and to certain pages can also be quite valuable. And thinking about your outreach strategy, I think like PR. So Jim, like if you were to get that Respona.com software, I would basically put that with the PR team so that instead of like, I mean, like, hey, I'll give you $50 for a link, like might work sometimes, right? But what works a lot better and is a lot more leveraged and scalable is like if you look at other websites that you'd actually like to partner with and think about it less like, hey, let me post a blog post on your website for a backlink, and more like, hey, how might we partner together? I had Larry Kim on my podcast a while back. Larry Kim is the growth genius behind WordStream, which he sold for a bunch of money. And my podcast is all about secrets. So I asked him basically like, hey, what's your big secret? That's how every episode starts. And what he described as the ultimate growth hack, which some of you are going to like, some of you are going to hate, your CEO probably will like it and get excited about it, is to build your brand. I've got a lot of respect for Larry Kim, but when he first said that, I was like, dude, what? You're talking about frou brand stuff? And he was like, no, because get this. I have reason to believe that one of the key ranking factors SEO-wise for Google is, well, everybody knows it's trust, if you can get Google to trust you. But Google also knows when somebody searches for your brand because they'll show the page differently. Like you'll be pretty dominant usually if somebody's searching for your brand. So Google knows what your brand is. If Google sees the number of searches, the search volume for your brand growing on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis, that's a strong trust signal versus a brand whose search volume is eroding or just staying stagnant at a very small level. So if you can build your brand and get more people searching for you by name on a regular basis, that's a huge leg up, not just for SEO rankings and increasing your trust, but guess what? The Google Ads ranking looks at a very similar thing. The Facebook ads relevancy scores and ranking, like all of the algorithmic trust engines that are built and operated by, the big four and the walled gardens are all really geared to how trustworthy is your brand. And the most direct signal to that is how much search volume are you getting and how is the trajectory of growth of that search volume. So if you go to your CEO and say, hey, we need to do SEO, he'll probably be like, get the intern to do it. But if you say, hey, we need a coordinated PR strategy to get our thought leadership out into the market so that we can build brand equity and grow faster and easier over time, then you'll have their attention.
Yep. Yeah, book I strongly recommend for this is Dave Gerhardt's Founder Brand, which is all about this, how to get your CEO bought in, how to get them excited about building a brand for themselves and for their company. Using something like that will give you a lot of leverage to have that conversation.
I really like that you brought that up also, Chris, because we talk a lot about like building content. But if you look at like the pie chart of the ranking factors, the largest slice has always been around that domain authority, which people think of as like, how many backlinks do we have? But one of the main factors in that is your brand strength, right? And so building your authority is not just about building backlinks. What Chris is saying about building your brand and your brand search volume going up as an important signal for Google, like that's huge as well. So I want to underline that.
And as an SEO, like you can't help but to use all the buzzwords. You're like, our domain authority, our keyword density, da da da. But in order to really be successful, you do need C-level buy-in because it takes investment and it takes time, right? And the best way to do that, I think, is by taking our geeky lingo and translating it into, MBA talk and CEO talk, because they're the same thing. Like we're talking about the same thing, we're just using different language. So if we can adapt our language, then it will be better heard, better understood, land better. And then you're likely to get the investment that you need to really scale it.
Yep. Quick question from Ben: SEO Surfer versus SEM Rush.
Yeah, Ben, good question. Because I talked about both of them, and this is how I use them. Both tools are pretty robust and have a lot of different functions in them, but I usually think of SEMrush. It does a great job at like tracking keyword rankings on a daily basis, does a great job of really robust and quick competitor research, like the kind of heat map, ranking heat map that I was showing you. Competitive research is one of the main things that I use it for. SEO Surfer, on the other hand, I really look at as more of a tool once you start content planning and really putting together the outlines or actually writing the content itself. So I mentioned, I showed that kind of analysis of the different keywords and things. And then Jared, I don't know if you went to the last page there, but yeah, it's also got, word count as well, and a bunch of other stuff. And actually, if I send you this, Jared, I don't know if it'll actually pull up because I'm logged in, but if you can pull that up, it's kind of like the full report on a page. So it gives you, more of what you get out of SEO Server. But anyway, it's kind of more specific to what is this one piece of content that I'm writing, rather than I look at SEMrush as something that helps me with my overall strategy and overall kind of like 30,000 foot view. But the other thing that I mentioned, Jarvis, one of the AI writing, or I'm sorry, Jasper, one of the AI writing tools has an integration with SEO Surfer that's really great. So that, the AI is basically writing with the guidance of SEO Surfer. So, there's all kinds of different tools and ways that they kind of integrate with each other. But that's kind of the main ways that I would use the two of them differently. And Jim, it looks like you're heading out, but glad you had a good time at the session.
Awesome.
Here's a spy tool that I like, which is paid.
I like spy tool also.
And it's got its own use cases, but that link that I just dropped is one of my favorites in terms of getting internal buy-in or interest. is called the combat tool, and it basically shows you and your competitors each in a circle, and the size of the circle represents the number of keywords that you're ranking for. Or the way that you would say that in CEO talk would be your impression share, or your share, your market share, basically.
Yep.
So the size of your market share, and then it overlaps into Venn diagram styles. So the overlapping portions show the areas that you plus competitor 1 are ranking, but not competitor 2, or that, you know, competitor 2 and competitor 3 are ranking, but not you. And anytime you show this to a group of executives, like, because on the link itself, you can like scroll through, you can click to see which keywords they're ranking for and which you're not. It's a way to, yeah, to speak in their language and to show them, because they're always interested in competitive metrics, I've found.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that heat map is something that usually people start salivating over when they're seeing like, oh, wow, our competitors are really beating us in these areas. But Ben, great translation, right? Like you can look at this and call it a total addressable market in kind of CEO terms. They'd probably really like that.
Like, our TAM's larger than Deloitte's. Like, how come they have more share of voice, or how come they have more market share?
Yeah, our share of voice. Let's go. Guys, this has been awesome. I guess, Alex, and one final thought in closing as we head to the end of the hour here. So if the folks on this call were to do one thing today to start scaling up their SEO, what action would you take and why?
I personally love competitive research, so I would go find similar kinds of sites out there that are ranking. Actually, what I would do, I would type in whatever the highest volume keyword you can think of that you want to rank for, and look at the top 3 results. And if you can put them into a tool, find what other things you know, that are on that site that are ranking, and use those as your kind of competitive baseline to then see what are the topics we should go after and how should we be writing about these things. To me, that's the lowest hanging fruit in terms of getting a scalable SEO strategy together really quickly.
Love it. Chris, any closing thoughts?
I'd buy 20,000 spammy links pointing to fake social media profiles. That no, I'm just kidding.
Sold.
I'm just kidding. No, I would probably look at the content engine. I would look to identify where the hidden content is in your organization, as well as take an inventory of the content that you already have that you might not be thinking about in with your SEO hat on.
Boom. That's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much for joining. 2 things before we finish. First thing, Alex, thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you for guest hosting. Second thing, if you guys haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do. Yes, we will be at Inbound 2022 next week. So if you're there, it's going to be myself and also Camille Bosley and Jason Keller from our team. Shoot us a text, hook up with us there. Love to catch up in person. Ben, really looking forward to it. Last thing, next week we are going to be talking all about third-party cookies and the supposed eventual death of third-party cookies and what, if anything, to do about it. So should be an interesting and fun and informative conversation. If you're around next week, I'm going to be at Inbound, but Chris will be here. Should be a good one to check out. So if we don't see you at Inbound, we'll see you on the Growth Clinic next week. Thank you guys so much for joining as always, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Much love. Have a great day.
Take care.
See ya. Bye.